This is the Workplace Podcast with your host, William Corless. Brought to you in association with Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner. Each week we focus on a different aspect of the workplace. We hear from guest speakers who are subject matter experts and who are incredibly talented at what they do. These experts will give you a different perspective and insight to work life, with the aim of empowering you to take a different path to success in all aspects of work life. These perspectives will include career and personal success, leadership, high-performance teams, and creating a better work-life culture and organisation. Yellowwood. Take a different path to success with your career, team, and organisation.
Welcome to the Workplace Podcast, and today's topic is making work fair. Will I be joined by Siri Chilazi? Siri Chilazi is a senior researcher at the Women and Public Policy Program at Harvard Kennedy School, whose life's work is to advance gender equality in the workplace. As a keynote speaker and strategic advisor, Siri collaborates with a wide range of organizations around the world. Her work regularly appears in leading media outlets. Siri has an MBA from Harvard Business School, a Master's in Public Policy from Harvard Kennedy School, and a BA in Chemistry and Physics from Harvard College. Siri, welcome to the Workplace Podcast.
Thrilled to be here, William. I'm so looking forward to our conversation.
So as I was showing you earlier on, there's lots of sticky notes here. What I like about this book is it's holistic. It's a systemic approach underpinned by the evidence-based approach that you've brought. Hence the subtitle on the book, Data-Driven Design for Real Results. And that's what I like about it is you mentioned so many examples of companies who have gotten this right, the practical ways of making work fair. And you give examples like Ericsson, Transport for London, Google, and many, many more. And then you introduce us to concepts such as the intention action gap, affirmative action plans, the norm champions, babysitting as an expense. We'll discuss all these things. What I really like is that your book mentions other podcast guests like Amy Edmondson or Liza Vesterlund. So we'll talk about that. You start off with the introduction about designing for fairness. And many of our listeners may not know about a Swedish engineer, Astrid Linder. So can you tell us and our listeners about the importance of Astrid and how this shapes society about building in fairness using that design approach?
Astrid Linder is the research director for traffic safety at the Swedish sort of national highway organization. And in her own words, her job is to make all occupants in cars on the roads as safe as possible. What Astrid and her team realized about a decade ago was that there was not in the world a dummy that cars would be safety tested on, where crashes would be simulated, that was based on a female's body and anatomy. All the dummies that were used in these car crash safety tests around the world were based on a man's anatomy, body shape, body size, body mass distribution. And it turns out there are some important biological differences, again, on average, between women and men that lead women to be meaningfully less safe in cars today. Even though women drive a little bit less around the world than men do, they are significantly more likely to be injured in car crashes around the world, especially in rear impact collisions. So Astrid and her team set out to develop the world's first crash test dummy based on the average female body. And building on her efforts now, there's more and more dummies that are being created by regulators around the world, by other researchers, by car companies. Here in the United States, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration just announced new rules to actually incorporate the use of these more diverse dummies into car safety testing going forward. So she's really ushered in a revolution in helping to make sure that all of us, whether we're driving, sitting in the passenger seat or sitting in the back of a car, are more safe. And the reason my co-author Iris and I share the story at the outset of the book is because we think it's such a beautiful example of how you can do what you're already doing, You don't have to change your job description. You don't have to become a member of a new task force or take a ton of new stuff onto your plate. You keep doing what you're already doing, but you make your own work more fair. And that's exactly what Astrid Linder did.
And that's what we're going to go into in more detail then in the podcast is how this can be inbuilt into the work system by design. But before we do that, I think it's important to discuss the myths then that we need to debunk. And you start the book off with this with Iris.
We highlight 7 myths that have gotten in the way of channeling our limited time, money, resources, effort, goodwill toward the things that work, and have sometimes caused us individually and as organizations to spend those resources on things that don't work. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. One is the idea that we need to change people's hearts and minds in order to change their behaviors. In other words, that we need to de-bias individuals in order to make better decisions. The research simply doesn't bear that out. In fact, there's a lot of wonderful evidence that shows that we can get people to behave differently, to make better, more objective, more fair decisions, even without tackling those deeply held values and beliefs that evidence suggests are actually really hard to change. So that's one of the myths that's been holding us back. Another one is this idea that we can leave it to a handful of people to fix fairness for everybody. You know that in a large organization, global company of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees, we can hire a chief diversity officer and staff up a team of 3 people, and now we're all set. I liken this to communications. Most larger organizations have some PR experts, maybe an internal corporate communication department that handles the most high-profile communications, the annual report, the CEO speeches. That's great. At the same time, every single person in that organization on a daily basis is writing emails, speaking up in meetings, creating PowerPoint presentations. In other words, they're communicating, and they need to have a base level of communication skills for the organization to function. And so it's exactly the same with fairness. Yes, experts have an important role to play in sharing, the best practices, helping educate people on what to do. But everyone needs to make their own work more fair in order for the organization overall to become a better environment.
And this is where you sometimes say that in the midst then, and this is what I really liked, is that your gains equal my loss. There's a zero-sum game. So, that could be a big thing where there can be like maybe a backlash towards DEI programs. This is just a token hire or something like that. Is there something to that we can actually overcome?
Yeah, that's another one of those myths, this idea that work or life is a zero-sum game. So if you win, that must mean I lose. Listen, of course, those situations exist. When we elect people into legislatures, the number of seats is fixed, right? So for every district, if one person wins that seat, well, someone else must lose. So it's not that zero-sum situations don't exist at all. However, research consistently shows that they are less prevalent than people think. And especially in the workplace, there's actually often an opportunity to expand the pie for everybody's benefit so that it doesn't have to be you or me, but it can be you and me. A really concrete example of this is corporate boards. The size of them isn't fixed. So if you want to diversify your corporate board, well, one way would be to kick out some existing members and replace them with different people. Another way is to expand the size of the board and bring in new people. And then, of course, over time, there will be turnover. We also give the example in the book of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a law that's over 30 years old here in the United States. It mandated things like elevators, in addition to stairwells. At the end of a sidewalk, you have to cut the curb so that it's on a wheelchair, smooth to roll down, for example. Well, that law was initially inspired by the experiences of people who are differently physically abled, such as folks in wheelchairs or using crutches. But how many of us have ever walked on the street with a grocery cart or suitcase or stroller with a kid in it in tow? Or how many of us have ever taken public transit with a suitcase going to the airport, or maybe with a bike? How many of us have ever temporarily used crutches because we broke our legs skiing, right? So it turns out those design changes made life better for all of us because we all have situations sometimes where we benefit from not having to take the stairs, but having an elevator accessible or having the curbs be smooth. And that's exactly what we suggest is the case with fairness at work too, is when we redesign our workplace systems and environments, they are become better for everybody.
I I really, really appreciate you giving us a different frame on that. And I'm going to go back to the subtitle of the book of Make Work Fair is Data Driven Design for Real Results. Now,
Mm.
here's a truism that's often used is what we measure, we treasure, or what gets measured, gets done, or what we don't
Yes.
get measured doesn't count. Like what's the learning about data then in organizations, how we capture it or maybe how we don't capture it, because this can be quite onerous on people.
It can, and at the same time, it can be shockingly simple. What it
Mm.
boils down to is this: when you want to achieve real results, you manage fairness the same way you manage your core business. So if you're in an organization that sells anything, whether it's a product or a service, you would never set out to design a new offering by saying, oh, let's just design something that maybe is modeled on what a competitor does. Best practices, we copy and paste what we see out there. Let's take our time building it. Let's launch it whenever it's ready. And then let's just see what the reception is in the marketplace. Never, right? You
Yeah.
would set out with a specific vision. You do market testing to understand what your customers need, what's not already out there. You try to build something novel. You test it rigorously with potential users. You'd have revenue targets in place. You'd have a deadline for when you want to launch. You'd have you'd manage the process in a very data-driven way. And then once your product is out there in the world, you continue to refine it. You collect all this data on profitability, how it's resonating with consumers, which markets are you performing well, which markets are you performing poorly in, and then you continue to refine. So what we're saying is this data-driven approach is exactly the same way that you have to manage fairness. It's about using a muscle that we've already developed, that we know how to deploy in one part of our business, now using those same skills and that same muscle to manage something else.
So here's a thing that some people might struggle with. You say, okay, so we have a balanced scorecard, or we have key performance indicators, or KPIs as they're known, and then we're trying to, you know, create goals that promote that desirable behavior. Is there
Mm,
anything you could say to that? Because sometimes people might say, oh, I am overwhelmed with all these KPIs, and a DEI KPI might go to the bottom of the list.
yeah.
What's the best way to promote that desirable behavior to make work fair?
Yeah, design is everything. That's one of the reasons why the word design is in the title of the book. We talk about it extensively throughout the whole book. And one of the points that we make is design is often not neutral. Just because something is structured or organized a certain way today doesn't mean that it's the best way. It also doesn't mean that today's design treats everybody fairly or that
Yeah.
it's somehow the most equitable way of organizing our workplaces. So the first thing to realize is this is a design question, and we actually have the power to make different design choices than we have today. I agree with you. There's a lot of KPIs floating around in organizations today, and the more you add on, the less relative weight each individual consideration has. So it comes down to prioritization, looking at what's really important, what are the key behaviors and the key outcomes that we want to drive, and then doubling down on incentivizing those. And by the way, when we talk about incentives, they could be financial, certainly.
Yeah.
Your compensation is contingent on something, we give you a bonus based on something, but they could also be reputational. One type of incentives that I've seen companies using is access to senior leaders. Or on the flip side, you're expected to do something, and if you don't meet the benchmark, if you don't hit your goal, the CEO is going to call you up and say, why didn't you hit your goal? What's
Yeah.
wrong? That's kind of a reverse incentive, but highly effective for senior leaders who want to appear favorably in the eyes of the CEO.
Speaking of senior leaders, then, and this is something that really captured me then, and we talk about executive compensation and we talk about the role of the board that we talked about there. And this was a fascinating insight, or a different way of thinking that you could relate making work fair with executive compensation, that this is
Mhm.
completely at the top, it's designed in or baked in. Can Can you tell us a little
Yeah.
bit more about that concept? Like, this is fascinating because for
Yeah.
me, it's a game changer.
Many organizations, including Verizon, for example, the telecommunications company, have in fact done this and have even been public about it. There's a whole host of other companies that I know are doing this behind the scenes, but not sharing it publicly. It goes back to we measure what we treasure.
Mm.
So a company's their incentive compensation, right? And what they want their senior leaders to drive toward and achieve is a reflection of what they feel is really important. And the reason I believe fairness considerations need to be up there is because they are essential for high performing organizations. At the end of the day, what do we mean by making work fair? We mean that we choose the right people to do the right jobs in the right roles at the right time so that they can bring their full talents to bear. And who benefits? The organization. Because when the best people are doing the right jobs, you as an entity are higher performing and you're better able to reach your own targets in the marketplace. So if we actually all collectively understand that that is important and a critical enabler of high organizational performance, then 100% that should be something that we're incentivizing senior leaders to do. What might be some of those concrete considerations, those fairness considerations that get baked into executive compensation? It could be something more sort of basic or commonplace like representation. It could look at career progression. So in a lot of companies, we see that at the entry level, for example, the workforce is roughly 50-50 women and men. But as you get to first line, second line managers, we're 60% men, 40% women. And as we get to the most senior ranks, we're maybe 75% men and 25% women. So that's not a question of talent availability because the talent is available. And in fact, you've already brought it in-house at the entry level. This is a question of how are you as an organization developing that talent in-house? How are you giving people opportunities to show what they're capable of? How are you matching people to the right roles so that they have an opportunity to thrive? How are you supporting them? Support could look like access to high visibility projects, access to senior leadership, internal training, mentorship, sponsorship. This is all stuff that is within the organization's control. So it might be quite reasonable to hold senior leaders accountable for those types of things.
And just as you mentioned that there, so you talked about mentorship and sponsorship, and I think sometimes these get confused. And you talk about this in the book at the very end of the book, if I recall correctly. And there's a big difference between sponsorship and mentorship, and sometimes sponsorship is probably more important.
There's a lot of different phrases people use to distinguish mentorship and sponsorship. A short one that I like is mentors speak to you, sponsors speak about you. So a mentor can really be anybody, peer, someone who's more senior, inside your organization, outside your organization, someone who gives you advice and counsel and helps you navigate the workplace. That's really valuable. A sponsor is someone who is more senior or more powerful or has more influence than you, and importantly, is willing to use that influence to advance your career. So typically, a sponsor is someone in your organization, a couple of levels above you, who can help pound the table on your behalf when they're in that performance evaluation calibration meeting where you are not. And they can say, no, William needs to get that highest rating. Or no, I want to put William on this new big time project. I know he's ready. Trust me. I have the credibility in my peers' eyes. I can vouch for William and his competence. Let's give him a chance. And the reality is sponsors are critical in most organizations to people getting promoted, getting access to those chances to make meaningful leaps forward in their career.
So, what this podcast is all about is opening minds so people can take a different path to their career or team or organization. And you and Iris in the book then state in chapter 3 that setting goals very distinctive from quotas are important, and we can learn a lot from the 30% club. Now, some listeners, I'm cognizant, may not be aware of the 30% club, so you might have to explain that.
Yeah.
So if we can go into that setting goals versus quotas, because you were said, well, just expand the board amounts. We're not going into a quota argument, for example. Can you just tell us a little bit more why we should
Yeah.
set goals then?
Yeah. These are two terms that often get confused. So quotas are mandated targets that are often imposed by a legislative entity who has the power to enforce them and the power to implement some negative consequences. So, for example, in many countries, there's legislative quotas in place for women's representation on corporate boards or women's representation in political leadership, either on party lists in elections or even in India, for example, very famously 30 years ago, they reserved a third of village head positions for women on a random rotating basis. Goals, on the other hand, are voluntary, often set by individuals or organizations themselves, and there's not an external entity that will either reward or punish you if you meet the goal or not. And I think this distinction is very important because while quotas are extensively used around the world, well more than a half of the world's countries have some kinds of quotas in place, there are places like the United States where quotas are illegal. But goals are not. Goals are not illegal. Anybody can set goals for themselves. And one example that you referenced is the UK's extremely successful effort over the last 15 years to increase women's representation on corporate boards. That was not reliant on quotas. That was a business-led and voluntary effort. Where organizations, influenced by the government, certainly, and initially coalesced by the government. In 2011, when the representation of women stood at 12.5%, they set themselves a goal to reach 25% in 4 years. So to double the representation of women on the FTSE 100 boards, the boards of the 100 largest companies. That was an unbelievably ambitious target, right? Doubling in 4 years. Well, they met that target because they were focused. There was more attention on the issue. The media was helping to raise the profile of the issue and keep it top of mind. Academics were helping to generate more research. This coalition included search firms who play an important role in identifying candidates for boards and helping to place candidates on boards. So they were kind of activated and galvanized to support this effort. And then, of course, the 30% Club, an organization founded by Helena Morrissey, who played a key role in bringing the coalition together, doing one-on-one outreach to the chairman of the FTSE 100 companies. And I say chairman because at the time, 99 of the 100 chairs were, in fact, men, to raise the importance of the issue, to convince them to kind of get on board and be more mindful of diverse candidates as they were seeking their board seats. When they met the goal in time in 2015, they set a new goal to get to 33%. They met that goal again, slightly ahead of schedule in 2020. Now they've set a new goal to hit 40%. They've already met that target by 2025. So the transformation that has happened in less than 15 years has been remarkable. And it was all driven by these voluntary self-set goals that got all the individuals and organizations involved to focus their efforts and sort of pull collectively in the same direction.
So years ago, I was in the States. You said you grew up in Boston earlier on. And I was in Boston when I heard first, I think it was in 99, I heard about the Rooney Rule. Now, the Rooney Rule, I was a young Irishman in Boston, and I thought this was just out there in terms of thinking that you had to have a certain profile in your workforce. It was just an alien concept to us as Irish people, and that's a long time ago, obviously. What is the Rooney Rule, and why was it put in place, and was there any benefits to it, or can you explain our listeners to that?
The Rooney Rule originated in the National Football League, the NFL, in the United States, where there's 32 football teams playing. And it was named after Dan Rooney, the legendary owner of the Philadelphia team, who led a task force whose mission was to increase the diversity of the head coaches in the league. In the NFL, throughout time, especially in the last 30 years, the players are on average 60 to 70% Black. However, the coaches, the team owners, the head coaches, overwhelmingly white. And so the league has been working for decades to increase, to close those gaps, to diminish, close the disparity and make sure that Black players and coaches have an equal opportunity to be considered for the most prestigious positions. So the Rooney Rule, when it was first introduced, stated that for every head coach position that's open, you have to interview at least one non-white candidate. Now, initially, the rule looked like it was going to have some success. The number of non-white head coaches increased from 0 or 1 to 7 or 8. And again, there's 32 teams. There was even a Super Bowl within a few years where both teams, the Super Bowl is the final game, that determines the championship in the football league. Both head coaches of the two teams that were playing were Black. And then after that focused attention of the first couple years, we started backsliding. And at one point a few years ago, only 3 of the 32 teams had a Black head coach. One of the things that anecdotally has happened is that teams will have already decided which coach they want to hire. They might have even extended an offer to that coach. And then they'll just go and interview a Black candidate to check the box and say, oh, yes, we satisfied the role. So I think this is an important reminder, too, that we can have the best intentions and we can have good policies on paper, but if they are not lived out in practice, they're not worth much. The teams at the time didn't necessarily fully buy into this. There was no accountability mechanism. So if teams didn't abide by the Rooney Rule, there was no entity that could sanction them, fine them, penalize them in any way. So there was not necessarily a huge incentive for them to comply either. The Rooney Rule has now become very popular in companies which have instituted goals that say, okay, for every C-suite position, we'll interview at least one candidate who's a woman or a person of color. And these goals can be helpful. But one important thing I want to point out is the Rooney Rule and other similar goals that we call slate goals. They're all about the process, right? They focus on who will you interview. They're not about the actual outcomes or the results. Who did we in fact hire? So, of course, if you don't even interview someone, you're not going to hire them. So the composition of the finalist pool or that slate of candidates definitely does matter, but it's not enough. Because at some point, we want to see those real end results of different people actually getting hired. So slate goals can be an important tool, but they're not everything.
Yeah, and you alluded to this earlier on because you talked about accountability, and then I think you alluded to comply or explain approaches where you have to explain to the CEO why isn't this done. What's the role of accountability or social accountability? Because if one department does it, then obviously it's going to be successful. It's going to make another department not look so great at the eyes of the CEO. Is there something
Yeah.
to that? That is it peer pressure or what is it?
Accountability is an incredibly powerful tool, and there's a ton of research to show that it's one of the most potent ways to shift behavior. Put simply, we humans care inherently about what others think. We don't want to be out of the club or the only person who's going left when everyone's going right. We want to be part of the herd. And that's where the sort of magic of accountability comes in. We're more likely to be on our best behavior when we know that we're being watched and when there's a prospect that we might have to explain or justify our decisions. And there's so many wonderful examples of this, from the workplace to umpires in Major League Baseball in the US, where umpires made less racially biased calls on the playing field when they had been told that they were filmed and there was a camera, and that they might have to just, that we would have the footage to back up every decision that you made. And if you didn't make the right call, you might have to explain it. So we just simply are more likely to be objective when we know that we're being watched. But the key here is that there has to be something to close the loop of accountability. So is it the CEO who's gonna come back and ask you about your hiring decisions? We actually worked with a large multinational company to institute something like this. The company wanted senior executives to groom their successors in proportion to their representation in the company. So let's say you're a senior leader, you have 10 people reporting up to you, 5 are women, 5 are men. You have a 50-50 pool from which to promote, right? Yeah. But if actually over the last 4 years, 90% of the time you've selected a man for a new promotion or important role, well, you're not promoting in proportion to your pool. And so we informed senior leaders about this. We showed them their personal track record of promotion so that they had the data to understand where they stood. And then the accountability came in the form of the CEO, who agreed to review people's promotion track records with them in their quarterly one-on-one meetings. And it made a huge difference because the CEO's direct reports, those senior leaders, knew credibly that their actions were being watched and that they would be asked to explain if they were making promotions not in proportion.
So I may be wrong of how I read this, but is that linked to identity-based impression management then, that we're choosing people that are similar to us? Is that what's going on there, or did I get that backwards?
Identity-based impression management is a little bit different. It's something that we've seen in research where people, especially when they can see that they're in a minority in an organization, right? They look around and they don't see very many people who look like them. They often take and feel like they have to take extra efforts to fit the organization, to fit the mold, to get the same opportunities to advance, to be considered for opportunities as others. One example of this is resume whitening, which is this phenomenon whereby people, especially in the US context, actually in the North American context, some of these studies were done in Canada as well, who are not white, strategically choose what to include or not on their resume to appear more white. So for example, if you have an ethnic sounding name, a name that might make it clear that you're from Asia or from Africa, you might instead choose an Anglo sounding name so that people can't necessarily tell right off the bat from looking at your name that you're not a white North American. Or if in university you were involved in a student group that was the South Asian Students Association, for example, you might strategically omit mention of that because you don't want to highlight or draw attention to the fact that you have South Asian heritage. Unfortunately, that works. People who whitened their resumes in studies were more likely to get called back for job interviews. But it's not something that I would ever, propose anyone to do, right? This is where it comes back to this question of, do we need to fix individuals? Do individuals need to behave differently to fit a broken system? I would argue no. Instead, we have to fix the system. Let's change our hiring practices so that they don't penalize people for having been a member of the South Asian Student Association or for having a non-English sounding name.
And that's what it is. It's about re-establishing new norms by design. And you introduced this concept of norm violators then. So I think, and the reason I'm bringing out these different concepts, Siri, is that this book is so good with educating people on in different aspects there. So can you tell me a little bit, what are norm violators?
So norms are the shared but often unspoken understandings of what behavior is acceptable and expected in a given situation. And norms are very powerful shapers of our behavior precisely because, as we discussed a moment ago, we humans want to belong. We don't want to get called out for doing something different than everyone else is doing, or doing something that is not perceived to be the right thing to do in a given situation, which is why we're likely to follow the herd. And it turns out that creating social norms, shifting and shaping social norms is one of the easiest and most powerful ways to get people to behave the way we want them to, or to shift culture, right? To transform our workplace environments from ones where some people feel like they don't belong, some people feel like they're ostracized or called out, transform those types of environments to ones where everyone feels like they can actually do their best work. So I'll give you a simple example from meetings. Sometimes people come late. Sometimes meetings don't start on time. It's disruptive. We don't get as much work done as we'd like to. But if that's just what everybody is doing, and if it's viewed as acceptable, it's kind of hard to shift people's behaviors to, from now on, meetings are going to start and end smack on time. So, what are some of the ways that we could do that? This goes back to norm violators. Well, the first step might be that you collectively as a team agree on the new norm and say, hey, listen, for efficiency reasons, to increase productivity and to respect everybody's time, from now on, can we all collectively agree that we are going to start meetings on time? Okay, great. We all agree. Well, the next time someone violates that norm and shows up late, it's important to call them out, not just to change their behaviors, but to reinforce the norm for the rest of the group and to say, William, I'm so glad you were able to join us at 10:05. We've actually already covered the first 3 items on the agenda. Now, that sounds pretty mean, and maybe it is a little bit, but research shows it's highly effective because it reminds you, William, that we've changed the protocols. We do start meetings on time. And it also reinforces for everyone else who did show up, yes, you did the right thing. We are not going to be tolerating these, tardiness going forward.
I can guarantee my listeners I would never show up late for a meeting. I'm just joking. But you talk about shifting culture there. And when we talk about shifting culture, then you talk about change management. And one of the aspects you talked about that is the proof of concept when it comes to change management. I think that's a really good thing to let our listeners know, that proof of concept. Why is that important?
It's so important because once you have results to point to and an evidence base that something works, it's so much easier to convince people to go along with you. Roz Atkins, a journalist at the BBC, did this extremely effectively. He started what has now grown into the global 50-50, the Equality Project, whose aim is to represent the world accurately as it is in journalism. And to give women and men equal voice in journalism. So Roz Atkins, when he started this project in 2017, actually didn't know how many women and men he was featuring as experts and commentators on a nightly primetime news show that he presented at the BBC. So he decided to start counting himself with his team at the end of every night show. Okay, we were on air for an hour. In that time, how many women and how many men appeared on screen? So the first thing they did is, in the absence of data, they found a way to generate that data themselves, which I think is very powerful. Then they set themselves a goal of getting to 50-50 gender parity. They got there over 4 months and then stayed there for years, which is also very impressive. But importantly, in that process, they proved that journalists who are really busy and overwhelmed, and the nature of news is fast-paced and unexpected things are happening all the time, even in that kind of environment, Roz Atkins and his team of journalists, editors, producers was able to make the methodology work. So once they had this proof of concept, they were then able to start sharing their method with colleagues and other teams and say, hey, listen, here's something that we started doing in our work. Very small, subtle change. It just took 2 minutes a day. It worked for us. You might consider doing this as well. And because they had done it themselves, they were able to answer every possible objection. When people said, oh, I don't have time. What if the best contributor is a man? Does this mean I now have to always put a woman on air? No, by the way, their golden rule was the best contributor always goes on air. They had those answers at the ready to counter people's objections and to give them concrete tools to implement the same methodology in their own work. So that's the power of a proof of concept.
And that's the same really when there's a job application then, isn't there? It's not, we're hiring the best person, isn't it? So when we come to an
Yes.
application process then, and I read this fact in the book that recruiters only spend 10 seconds reading a CV. So when it comes to the application process then, what advice would you give to HR directors or chief people officers that are listening to this podcast now when it comes to the application process? Is there anything that they could maybe have a review about and say, listen, let's change the norm about this, or let's design something that makes it more fair?
There are many, many evidence-based practices. That's the great news, right? Is we've done so much research to actually show what works and what doesn't to make hiring decisions more objectively. And we use that phrase, best person for the job, on purpose and a little bit provocatively, frankly, because best is often in the eye of the beholder. It turns out it's not so straightforward or so easy to determine who is the best person. I'll give you one example, and this has a solution embedded in it. The format of the resume or the CV. The typical format asks candidates to list the position that they held and then the dates associated. So management consultant, 2020 to 2024. Well, that design of the format makes experience gaps very salient. So if your previous job was from 2015 to 2018 and the next one started in 2020, it begs the question, what was happening in those 2 years from 2018 to 2020? Our colleagues ran an experiment with more than 9,000 firms in the UK where they redesigned that format so that you would still list the experience you had, management consultant, and then the associated number of years, 4 years, instead of the exact dates. So you don't lose really any information, you just present it in a different way. And what they found is that, of course, this design makes career gaps much less visible. And in fact, both women and men were more likely to get called back for an interview under this new scheme because employers weren't distracted by looking at the career gaps, but were actually just focused on the skills and the experiences and the competencies that the candidates brought to bear. So this is one example of how our current hiring practices sometimes don't allow us to find the best person or the right person because we get distracted by considerations that shouldn't really matter. There's actually no evidence to suggest that someone with a career gap is going to have any worse performance on the job than someone with a continuous work history. So that's one example of a simple design change. Other ways that we can make hiring more objective: predetermining criteria and focusing those assessment criteria on skills rather than things like the name of the school that you went to or the field that you got your degree in, or even the number of years of experience. We all know examples of people who, you've got two colleagues, each of them have done this job for 5 years. Does that mean that they're equally good? Bring the same set of skills? No, it doesn't. The length of experience tells you something, but it doesn't tell you everything. And there's a lot of beautiful research emerging showing that when we move away from these types of check the box qualifications to actually thinking about what are the things that are required to succeed in this role. What are the things that a person needs to be able to do, as opposed to what piece of paper do they have from an institution as evidence of a degree? We're able to make better matches between open roles and the people who fill them. So being more thoughtful about our criteria, making sure that they're unbiased and decided in advance. And then the last thing I'll throw out there as a general way of improving hiring decision-making is just increasing the amount of structure and formality. Structure has been shown to be the enemy of bias, whereas informality and ambiguity is where bias thrives and can come into play. So something as simple as in an interview, asking all the candidates for a given role the same set of questions in the same order, and then grading their answers one by one horizontally. So looking at each candidate's answer to question 1, grading those, then moving on to question 2 and looking at everybody's answers. That can just help us more objectively assess the quality of the candidate's work.
Now, we keep speaking about design. That's how this whole book is underpinned. And in relation then to career advancement, then you give us this concept of the opt-out frame. Now, it reminds me of the law that we have in Ireland that was recently enacted when it came to organ donation, that it's more of you opt out rather than opt in. So just tell us a little bit about that, because this is when we talk about career advancement and I suppose gender diversity in senior roles. Can you tell us a little bit about this concept?
Yeah, this is the design of systems, whether they're opt-out or opt-in, is a really powerful example of how small design choices can have huge impacts on people's behaviors. So when a system is opt-in, like organ donation, you have to fill out an extra form to indicate that you want to donate your organs in case. Or retirement savings systems, right? That's another great example. In a lot of workplaces, when you do your onboarding paperwork, you then have to fill out extra paperwork if you want the company to automatically withhold a portion of your paycheck and put it into your retirement savings account. In an opt-out system, we flip the default. so that by default, you are enrolled to be an organ donor. By default, you are put into the company's pension savings plan. And then if you want to opt out, that's when you have to fill out the form. So you still retain full freedom to do whatever you want. You can be part of the plan or not. But by switching the default, we switch which condition you have to do more work in. So when do you have to fill out those forms? Take the time, go through the trouble. And we know from behavioral science that we humans often tend to take the path of least resistance. So whatever is the easiest way, whatever is the default, the overwhelming majority of humans tends to stick with that. In Austria, for example, where they switched to that opt-out system for organ donation earlier, researchers studied the effects and found that organ donation rates went from the teens, so between 10 and 20%. Once the scheme was changed, they jumped to more than 90%, just because of the design of the system. To me, this also brings up an interesting question of agency and intention and free will, right? Because if at first you've got only, let's say, 12% of people who want to be organ donors, and then 2 years later, as a result of a system change, all of a sudden more than 90% want to, you got to ask yourself how deliberate, how intentional were people being about this decision in the first place? And I have to say, on a personal note, the more I study human behavior and how to change it, the more humble I get about thinking about my own everyday decisions, right? When I think, oh, I was so deliberate, I was so intentional, I truly made this decision very thoughtfully, we are much more at the mercy of our environments and the systems and processes that surround us than we even realize. So going back to promotions, how does this apply? In most organizations, promotions are an opt-in system where either your manager has to propose you for a promotion, or you need to raise your hand and say, I'd like to be considered for a promotion. But point is, it's opt-in. We also have research to show that women, and in the US context, people of color, are less likely to put themselves forward, often because they accurately fear some backlash. Women are not expected to be as self-promotional and as agentic as men are expected to be by stereotypes. And so when women are kind of putting themselves forward, raising their hand, saying, I want a promotion, I want this and that, they are often socially penalized. So one way to get around this is to institute an opt-out promotion scheme where after a certain amount of time, a standardized amount of time in a given role, all people who have, let's say, spent 3 years as an analyst will automatically be considered for promotion to the next rank. It doesn't mean that they're automatically promoted. It also doesn't mean that they can't opt out if they don't want to be considered or their manager doesn't want them to be considered. But point is, it helps to level the playing field.
And I like that point about leveling the playing field, and it gives everybody the opportunity, and that's what it's all about. And speaking about that then of opportunities, then sometimes we're rewarded and how rewards or promotions are allocated, then it's really important. And I love this aspect of the East framework. So I do a lot of work helping people with performance reviews, how to performance management, to do workshops on this. And this East framework, I think, is brilliant and simple as well, I must say.
It was developed by the UK Behavioral Insights team just over a decade ago, and that acronym EAST stands for Making Behavior Change Easy, Attractive, Social, and Timely. So if you want people to do something different than what they're doing today, you have to make it easy, attractive, social, and timely for them to do so. So quick examples: making something easy, we just talked about defaults. Following the default is easier than filling out a bunch of forms to do something different. So if we can make the default behavior the behavior that we want to see, the default, that's one way of making it easier for people. Attractive, how do we make things attractive for people? Well, incentives are one way, right? We celebrate and reward publicly the behaviors that we want to see. And then when people do something else, there needs to be some consequences. Maybe they get penalized. Maybe they get called out. Maybe the CEO knocks on their door and says, hey, 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 why does your promotion track record look like this? That's an example of making things attractive. Making things social is all about leveraging those norms that we discussed and the fundamental tendency of humans to want to follow the herd and want to belong. So how can we make the new behavior that we want to see the new norm? This is what happened at the BBC when Roz Atkins started sharing the 50/50 project. He, in the beginning, strategically targeted colleagues and programs that he knew were influential. Those people that everyone else in this massive global organization of the BBC tended to sort of look up to and follow. And once those teams and those individuals came on board the 50/50 project, it very quickly became the new norm, where everyone was looking around and saying, oh yeah, that's what we do now. We track representation in our journalistic content to make sure that it accurately represents the world we cover. And then finally, the T in East, making behavior change timely. Well, this goes back to setting goals, having clear targets that are time bound. It also is about speaking to people in the moments that matter. So let's say we are changing our performance evaluation process to make it less biased and more fair. Well, we could talk to managers about it the first week of January. But if they're going to be doing these performance evaluations 11 months later in December, by that point, they've long forgotten what the whole point of the new process is and why it's important to deep bias performance evaluations. So what we want to do instead is talk to people in the moments that they're already paying attention. If someone's about to start writing reviews, talk to them 3 days or 2 days or a week before they write those reviews, so that the information, the prompts, the nudges will be top of mind for them. That's making behavior change timely.
Another concept in the book, we mentioned this at the very start of the podcast, including babysitting as an expense for networking events, and especially if someone's a single parent or whatever. And this is where it helps, I suppose, career advancement. It helps networking opportunities. There's a whole range of benefits to this. Can you just tell us, the reasoning behind that and why companies should consider this? Because this is an out there concept, really, isn't it?
As with many of these
so much
things,
sense.
once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it goes back to how making work fair is often simpler than we realize. It's often about making small tweaks to the things that we're already doing to make them better and more fair. So a lot of companies have expense policies where if you go to, let's say, a client dinner, you'll get you can expense the cost of the dinner. You can expense your transportation to and from the dinner. If it's out of town so that you need to stay in a hotel for a night after the dinner, you can expense that too. But in many cases, what can you not expense? You can't expense the cost of the childcare or the babysitter that would allow you to attend the dinner in the first place. So we have embedded into our policies and our ways of working these expectations about what people's life outside of work look like. In this case, the assumption that's embedded into the expense policy is either you don't have a family, or if you have a family or any kind of obligations outside of work, you can drop them at any time. Right? There's someone else to pick up the slack, someone else to take care of those obligations so that you can go entertain clients any night of the week. And that's a fundamental unfairness that's baked into our systems. So the good news is it's pretty easy to fix. We can simply amend that policy to say, okay, and if one of the things that enables you to attend this dinner is that you need to get a babysitter, then yes, you can expense the cost of that as well. I got a great question the other day from someone, which is, wow, these kinds of things are invisible. And I said, with respect, they are very visible to the people who are impacted by them. I've explained this expense situation as a question to many women. I'll say, listen, the expense policy covers the dinner, the transportation, the hotel. What does it not cover? There's not a woman I've encountered yet who within 5 seconds has said, oh, it doesn't cover childcare. because they live this reality every day. They are faced with these hurdles every day. So to all leaders, whoever you are, woman, man, it doesn't matter. I would exhort you to listen to what people who have different lives than you are sharing about their experience, because they are seeing things that you may not see. Maybe because you don't have kids, maybe because you have a stay-at-home spouse, maybe because your kids are already in their 30s, right? Maybe because your own parents have passed on, and so you don't have elder care responsibilities. But point is, the people who work for you, your colleagues, they have different lives, they have different obligations. Listen to what they are telling you about the hurdles that they are encountering in your organization, and then use your own power to remove those obstacles to allow everyone to do their best work.
And to build onto that, then the work of Lisa Vesterlund on non-promotable tasks. For our listeners, definitely check that out. Now, to quote your co-author, then I think Iris Bonnet, if I have pronounced her name correctly, then
Perfectly.
oh, thank you so much. I've practiced that. She wrote about the thin file that can prevent promotion. So we're going to finish up on this, our last question. So what is the thin file, and how can we tackle that if it is preventing promotion?
This is one of those ways in which organizations provide support to people on their journey up the ladder. And unfortunately, the research is quite clear that not everyone gets the same support and the same resources to succeed. The thin file phenomenon specifically came out of work with a law firm where people enter as associates. They're typically associates for 5 or 6 years, more or less, before they get evaluated for promotion to partner. And at this evaluation point, what was happening in this one law firm is people were looking at the files of the associates and saying some of them just have a thinner file than others, which means they've worked on fewer projects, or they've worked on fewer high profile, high visibility projects, or they've had fewer senior partners that they've worked with and had a chance to impress. So of course, come promotion time, the people who have more of a track record, more evidence of, oh, I worked on such and such deal and I brought in this client, and look, I know 10 of the 12 senior partners. Of course, that person is going to be advantaged compared to someone who only worked with 2 senior partners and for whatever reason got stuck on some of the less glamorous, less high profile work. It doesn't mean that these 2 people are necessarily differentially able or capable. They might actually be equally good lawyers, or the second one might even be better. But the point is, they weren't given the same opportunities to show what they could do. That's the thin file. The good news is that as Lisa and co-authors, as they mentioned in their amazing book, The No Club, the quality of the work that people are asked to do, it can be measured. It can be tracked. We can equalize the allocation of both the high profile work as well as the sort of office housework or the grunt work behind the scenes, the taking meeting notes, booking meetings, writing memos, things that has to happen, but frankly isn't probably going to get anybody a promotion. This is another place where we can apply data-driven management, and we can apply the design of a system to help level the playing field. Something that the law firm did, for example, is they instituted a rotational system where instead of the senior partners picking associates, specific associates to work with, kind of indefinitely, associates were rotated after a set amount of time to work with different partners on different projects so that everyone got a chance to get a broader exposure. That's a simple example of leveling the playing field.
We are coming to the end of the podcast. I have been discussing with Siri Chilazi about her book with Iris Bonnet, Make Work Fair, data-driven design for real results. So Siri, if people were to find out more about you, about your book and what you both do, how might they do so?
I'd love to connect on LinkedIn. I'm very active there, Siri Chilazi. The website for the book is makeworkfair.com. Again, very easy to find. The book is available all around the world, anywhere where books are sold. And on our website, you can also sign up for our newsletter where we share the latest research insights, the newest data that's coming out about how we all can make our own work more fair. So I really look forward to connecting with you.
Siri, thank you so much for joining the Workplace Podcast.
It's been a real pleasure, William. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Workplace Podcast with your host, William Corless. Our special thanks to this episode's guest for sharing their expertise with us. If you found this episode valuable, please rate and review it. For updates on future episodes and to get in contact with us about any workplace topics, please follow Yellowwood on LinkedIn and Twitter at Different Paths. As always, you can head over to yellowwood.ie for any other information. Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner, provider of executive coaching, facilitation and training. Take a different path to success with your career, leadership, team and organisation.